The day my son told me I was toxic, the room felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I remember the exact sound of the word when it left his mouth. Not loud. Not angry. Just, final. Like a door clicking shut. We were sitting at the small round table in my kitchen, the one with the chipped edge I kept meaning to sand down. The kettle was screaming on the stove because I'd forgotten about it, and the smell of oversteeped tea hung in the air, bitter, sharp, nothing like the warmth I'd intended. My son, Daniel, wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the seam of the table, tracing it with his finger, as if it held answers he didn't want to hear from me. "Mom," he said quietly, "you're toxic. And I need space from that." Space. That word followed the other one like a shadow. I opened my mouth, closed it again. My hands were shaking, so I folded them into my lap, pressed my palms together the way I used to when I was nervous at church. I searched his face for something, hesitation, regret, anything, but all I saw was resolve. Borrowed resolve, I would later understand. But that day it felt like rejection dressed up as calm. "I don't understand," I finally whispered. "What did I do?" He exhaled, a long practiced sigh. "It's always something with you. The comments. The looks. The way you make Sarah feel unwelcome. We're done having this conversation." Sarah. His wife. The woman who had come into his life like a soft-spoken breeze, and somehow left me standing in the wreckage, wondering how everything I'd built could collapse so quietly. That was the last real conversation I had with my son for nearly 3 years. Before all of that, before words like toxic and boundaries became weapons instead of tools, my life was simple. Not easy, but steady. Predictable in a way that brings comfort as you age. I was a widow by then, 5 years into learning how to live without the sound of my husband's keys at the door. I worked part-time at the local library, mostly morning shifts, where the smell of old paper and floor polish grounded me. I knew which regulars preferred the window seats, and which ones liked to talk. I liked being useful in small, quiet ways. Daniel was my only child. I raised him in a modest 2-bedroom house with a narrow hallway and creaky floors that announced every step. He was a gentle boy, always had been. Sensitive. Thoughtful. The kind who brought home injured birds and cried when his goldfish died. When his father passed, Daniel became my anchor without even realizing it. Sunday dinners. Long phone calls. Fixing things around the house that I pretended not to know how to fix. When he met Sarah, I was relieved. She seemed polite at first. Soft-spoken. Always smiling, though it never quite reached her eyes. She shook my hand like she was meeting a coworker, not the woman who had carried the men she loved for 9 months. I told myself not to read into it. People show warmth differently, I reasoned. I was determined not to be that mother, the clingy one, the judgmental one, the stereotype everyone warned brides about. So I tried. God knows I tried. I invited them for dinner, asked about her job, complimented her cooking when she brought over store-bought lasagna, and called it homemade. I bit my tongue when she corrected Daniel in front of me or answered questions directed at him. I told myself love looks different from the outside. Still, there were moments. Little ones. The kind you brush aside until they pile up too high to ignore. She would flinch when I hugged Daniel goodbye. Not dramatically, just a subtle stiffening, a tightening of her jaw. She'd make jokes about emotional enmeshment that I pretended not to understand. When Daniel and I talked on the phone, she'd always be nearby, her voice drifting in from the background, reminding him of errands or plans he suddenly forgot. After they married, things changed faster. The phone calls became shorter. Then less frequent. Invitations stopped coming. Holidays were negotiated like ceasefires. If I asked to come over, there was always a reason it wasn't a good time. Sarah was tired, Sarah had a headache, Sarah needed a quiet weekend. Once at Thanksgiving, I overheard her whisper, "See. This is what I mean, after I asked Daniel if he wanted more mashed potatoes. I laughed it off, but something cold settled in my chest. I started replaying my words before speaking, censoring myself, worrying over tone and timing. Was I really that difficult? That harmful? I asked myself late at night, lying awake with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I read articles online about toxic parents, trying to see myself in the descriptions. Controlling. Manipulative. Self-centered. I didn't recognize the woman they described. But doubt is a powerful thing. It seeps in through cracks you didn't know were there. The final break came quietly, without raised voices or slammed doors. Just that afternoon in my kitchen. The kettle screaming. The word toxic hanging between us like smoke. After that, there was nothing. No calls. No visits. Birthdays passed with no card. Christmas mornings felt hollow, the tree lit but the house empty. I would pick up my phone some days, thumb hovering over his name, then put it back down. I didn't want to prove his point by pushing. Friends asked about Daniel. I smiled and said he was busy. That married life suited him. I became very good at lying kindly. Years went by that way. Quiet. Heavy. I learned how to live with unanswered questions and an ache that never quite dulled. I told myself this was my punishment for something I must have done wrong, even if I didn't know what it was. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known then, was that silence was not the whole story. Truth has a way of waiting. Of letting you believe the worst about yourself until the moment it finally steps into the light. And when it does, it doesn't whisper. It cracks everything open. Silence has a sound to it, if you live with it long enough. In my house, it sounded like the clock in the hallway ticking too loud at night, like the pipes knocking when the heat kicked on, like the echo of my own footsteps moving from room to room. I filled the days with routine because routine doesn't ask questions. Work. Groceries. Church on Sundays. The same pew, the same hymns, my hands folded tight in my lap. People at church stopped asking about Daniel after a while. I think they sensed the answer hurt too much. Or maybe they were afraid of hearing something ugly. Estrangement makes people uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into polite conversation. I tried to be honest with myself. I replayed every interaction with Sarah, looking for the moment I'd crossed some invisible line. I remembered the time I suggested she rest after dinner and she snapped, "I'm not fragile." Or when I mentioned Daniel used to love lemon pie and she said, sharply, "People change." Each memory felt like evidence against me. I even went to a counselor for a few sessions. A kind woman with gray curls and a voice like warm water. She asked me to talk about my childhood, my marriage, my fears. She listened carefully, then said something that stayed with me. Sometimes, she said, being called toxic says more about the environment than the person. I nodded, but I didn't fully believe her. It was easier to accept blame than sit with confusion. The first real crack in the story came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was shelving returns at the library when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it. No one called me in the middle of my shift unless it was an emergency. When I saw Daniel's name on the screen, my knees nearly gave out. I stepped into the supply room, the smell of dust and cleaning solution stinging my nose. "Hello." My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. There was a pause. Breathing on the other end. Heavy. Uneven. "Mom," he said. Just that. My name in his mouth again. I leaned against the metal shelf, steadying myself. "Daniel. Is everything okay?" Another pause. I could hear something else now, muffled voices, maybe. Or maybe it was just my heart pounding in my ears. I don't know," he said. I didn't know who else to call. I swallowed hard. "I'm here." That sentence came out automatically, like muscle memory. No bitterness. No lecture. Just truth. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice cracked. Can I come by tonight? I closed my eyes. The relief hurt almost as much as the years of waiting. Yes, I said. Of course. I spent the rest of my shift in a fog. My hands moved on their own, stacking books, stamping return slips, smiling when spoken to. My mind was racing ahead to the evening, rehearsing 100 different versions of what he might say. Apology. Explanation. Goodbye. When I got home, I cleaned the house even though it was already clean. I cooked too much food. Old habits die hard. I lit a candle in the living room, then blew it out, afraid it looked like I was trying too hard. When Daniel finally pulled into the driveway, it was already dark. The porch light cast long shadows as he walked up the steps. He looked thinner. Older. His shoulders slumped like he was carrying something heavy. I opened the door before he could knock. For a second, we just stood there, staring at each other like strangers who shared a history neither knew how to name anymore. Then he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. I breathed him in. Laundry detergent. Cold air. The familiar, aching comfort of my child. I'm sorry, he murmured into my shoulder. I didn't answer. I just held him. Some things need time before they can be spoken. Inside, we sat at the kitchen table again. The same one. I noticed the chip on the edge and wondered if he saw it too. I poured tea with steady hands this time. Chamomile. He didn't touch it. She left, he said finally, staring into the cup like it might tell him what to say next. I waited. She took some things. Not much. Just left. He rubbed his face with both hands. She said she needed space. The word landed between us like a bitter joke. I chose my words carefully. I'm sorry you're going through that. He let out a shaky laugh. She always said you didn't mean what you said. That you had hidden motives. I stiffened but stayed quiet. She said you were manipulating me. Turning me against her. I believed her. He looked up at me then, eyes red-rimmed and raw. I don't know why. I reached across the table and placed my hand near his. Not on it. Just close enough to offer, not force. What happened? I asked softly. He hesitated. Then he began to talk. It came out in pieces at first. Arguments that didn't make sense. Friends he'd stopped seeing because Sarah said they were toxic influences. Text messages she'd sent from his phone while he slept. The way she framed every disagreement as proof he was betraying her. She said if I talked to you, it meant I didn't respect her, he said. She said you were poisoning me against her. I felt something shift inside me. Not vindication. Not yet. Just a deep, aching sadness. And you believed that? I asked gently. He nodded. She was always so calm when she said it. Like she was just stating facts. There it was. The calm. The quiet control. The story I had lived inside without knowing its shape. What made you call me? I asked. He swallowed hard. I found something. The room felt suddenly too warm. The ticking clock too loud. In her email, he continued. Messages to her sister. About you. My fingers curled into my palm. What did they say? I asked, though part of me already knew. He looked at me, and for the first time since he arrived, I saw something close to shame in his eyes. They said, she needed me to believe you were the enemy. That it was the only way to keep me loyal. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. In that moment, the years of silence finally began to make sense. And understanding, I learned, can hurt almost as much as loss. Daniel didn't hand me the phone right away. He sat there staring at the tabletop, his jaw tight, like if he looked at me too long he might fall apart completely. I could see the fight inside him, the instinct to defend the woman he once loved clashing with the slow, painful realization that love had been used as a leash. "I didn't want to believe it," he said finally. "Even when I saw the messages, I kept telling myself there had to be context. That I was misunderstanding her tone." He pulled his phone from his pocket, hesitated, then slid it across the table toward me. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I hated that part of me wanted proof. Hated that another part needed it. The emails were long. Casual in tone. Almost playful. "She's starting to doubt herself," one message read. Good. As long as he sees her as the problem, he won't question me. Another, "If she cries, I'll just say she's manipulating him with guilt." Works every time. I felt sick. I set the phone down carefully, like it might break if I didn't. For a moment I couldn't speak. The kettle clicked off on the stove, forgotten again, the same way it had years ago. Some habits, it seemed, never changed. "She wrote this?" I asked quietly. Daniel nodded, his eyes filling. "I don't know how I didn't see it. Every time you reached out, she'd say you were testing boundaries. Every time I missed you, she'd remind me of something you supposedly did." I thought back to all the times my calls went unanswered. The messages left on read. The holidays spent alone. I had assumed distance was his choice. I had carried that belief like a stone in my chest. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked, not accusing, just tired. He flinched. "Because she said that was exactly what you wanted. To drive a wedge between us. She said if I talked to you, you'd twist things." I closed my eyes. The cruelest part wasn't the lies themselves, it was how neatly they fit into every fear I already had about myself. We sat in silence after that. The kind that isn't empty, but full to the brim with things neither person knows how to hold yet. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "There's more," he said. I looked up. "She told people things about you," he continued. "My friends. Her family. Even my boss, once. She said you were unstable. Controlling. That you didn't respect our marriage." A dull ache spread through my chest. "That explains a few things," I murmured. He frowned. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, suddenly aware of how small my voice sounded. "People stopped treating me the same. Like they were being careful around me. I thought it was just age. Or imagination." He looked stricken. "Mom. I'm so sorry." I reached for his hand then, finally letting myself touch him. He gripped back hard, like he was afraid I'd disappear again. "I should have protected you," he said. "Instead, I helped her hurt you." I shook my head. "You were protecting what you thought was your marriage. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human." But even as I said it, I felt something else stirring beneath the forgiveness. Not anger. Something sharper. A quiet reckoning. Because this wasn't just about hurt feelings. This was about years of carefully constructed isolation. And the truth, once exposed, doesn't stay private for long. A few days later, Daniel called me again. "They're asking questions," he said. "Who is they?" I asked. "Everyone," he replied. "My sister-in-law. My friends. Even her parents." I leaned back in my chair, listening. "She told people I cut you off because you were abusive," he continued. "But now that she's gone, the stories don't line up. Especially after I showed a few people the emails." I winced. "You showed them?" "I didn't want to," he said quickly. "But they kept pushing. Saying you must have done something unforgivable." I closed my eyes, remembering all the nights I'd wondered the same thing. "And?" I asked. "And now they're seeing it," he said. How she played people against each other. How she always needed an enemy. I thought of Sarah's calm smile. Her gentle voice. The way she framed control as concern. She's calling me non-stop, Daniel added. Saying I betrayed her. That you turned me against her. I almost laughed. Almost. Are you answering? I asked. No, he said. For the first time. I'm not. That night, I slept deeper than I had in years. Not because everything was fixed. But because the truth no longer lived only inside me. The next time I saw Sarah was at the grocery store. I hadn't planned it. I was standing in the produce aisle, weighing apples in my hand, when I sensed someone behind me. You learn to trust those instincts after a while. She looked thinner too. Her hair pulled back tight. Her eyes darted when she saw me, then settled into something cold. Well, she said lightly. I wondered when you'd crawl back into his life. I took a breath. The smell of citrus and floor cleaner filled my nose. My heart beat steadily, surprising me. I never left, I said calmly. I was pushed. Her smile twitched. That's not how he tells it. Then maybe he's telling it honestly for the first time, I replied. Her jaw tightened. For a moment the mask slipped. You always hated me, she hissed. You couldn't stand that he chose me. I looked at her then, really looked. And I saw fear beneath the anger. I wanted him happy, I said. I still do. She scoffed. You're just trying to look innocent now. I picked up my apples and placed them in the bag. I don't need to look innocent, I said quietly. I just need to be done. As I walked away, my hands were shaking. But it wasn't from fear. It was from something that felt dangerously close to freedom. Because when manipulation loses its audience, it doesn't just fade. It collapses. And the fallout, I was learning, had only just begun. The truth doesn't arrive all at once. It trickles out, piece by piece, through conversations that start awkwardly and end in long pauses. Through apologies that stumble over themselves. Through looks people give you when they realize they've been wrong. The first call came from Daniel's friend, Mark. I hadn't heard his voice in years. When I answered, there was hesitation on the line, followed by a deep breath. Mrs. Harper, he said, using the name I used to hear so often, I owe you an apology. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. For what? I asked, though I already knew. For believing things about you without ever asking, he said. Sarah told us you were controlling. That you emotionally manipulated Daniel. We thought we were supporting him by keeping our distance from you. I stared at the sunlight spilling across the floor. I understand, I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. More calls followed. Some were awkward. Some were clumsy. A few were defensive. But the pattern was the same. People had been fed a version of me that made sense only if you never looked too closely. At church, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Women who used to nod politely now lingered to talk. One of them squeezed my hand and whispered, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I smiled and said nothing. There was no need to reopen wounds that were finally closing. Daniel came by often during that time. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. He helped fix the loose cabinet hinge. We cooked together. Ordinary things. Healing, I learned, often happens quietly, in between the heavy conversations. One afternoon, as we folded laundry side by side, he stopped and looked at me. Did you ever think about giving up on me? He asked. I paused, holding one of his old t-shirts. The fabric was worn thin, soft from years of washing. Every day, I admitted. And every day, I chose not to. His throat bobbed. Why? I met his eyes. Because you were my son before you were anyone's husband. And because love doesn't disappear just because it's misunderstood. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. The real confrontation came weeks later. Sarah asked to meet. I want to explain, she said in a message she sent from a new number. Foreclosure. Daniel showed me the text. You don't have to see her, he said quickly. I thought about it long and hard. About what closure really meant. About whether this was for her, or for me. I'll meet her, I said finally. But not to argue. We chose a public place. A quiet cafe near the park. Neutral ground. She arrived early, sitting stiffly at a corner table. When I approached, she looked up with an expression that tried to be calm and failed. Thank you for coming, she said. I sat across from her. Say what you need to say. She folded her hands. Unfolded them. I never meant for it to go this far. I raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. I was afraid, she continued. Daniel was so close to you. I felt like I was always competing. So you turned me into the enemy, I said gently. Her eyes flashed. You don't know what it's like to feel second in your own marriage. I considered that. And you don't know what it's like to lose your child while he's still alive. She flinched. I didn't think you'd actually disappear, she said. I thought you'd fight harder. I let that sink in. Do you hear yourself? I asked quietly. You needed me gone, but not gone enough to stop proving I loved him. She looked away. I'm not here to punish you, I continued. I'm here to tell you something important. She looked back at me. You don't get to rewrite this story anymore, I said. The truth is out. And I'm done carrying blame that doesn't belong to me. For a moment, she looked small. Then angry. Then tired. This isn't over, she muttered. I stood. It is for me. I walked out before she could say anything else. Outside, the air was cool. The smell of cut grass filled my lungs. I felt lighter with every step. Not victorious. Just free. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and gold. I don't hate her, he said suddenly. I know, I replied. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. So do I said. But wishing doesn't change the past. Living honestly changes the future. He nodded, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in a long time, the silence between us felt peaceful. And in that quiet, I realized something important. Being called toxic had nearly broken me. But the truth had healed me. And sometimes, that's the most powerful revenge of all. Healing doesn't arrive with a celebration. There was no single morning where I woke up and felt fixed. No dramatic turning point where the past stopped whispering. Healing came the way dust settles, slow, almost invisible, until one day you realize the air is clearer. Daniel stayed close after that. Not in an overcorrecting way, not with guilt-heavy gestures or constant apologies. Just present. He called to tell me about his day. He stopped by unannounced with groceries. Sometimes he sat in the living room scrolling on his phone while I read, and neither of us felt the need to fill the space with words. Trust, once fractured, doesn't snap back into place. It has to be rebuilt, piece by piece, through consistency. One Saturday morning, we were planting flowers in the front yard. The soil was cool and damp, the scent of earth grounding. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at me. She used to say you wanted me all to yourself, he said quietly. I pressed a small marigold into the dirt. Did you believe that? I think part of me did, he admitted. It was easier than admitting I'd chosen someone who wanted control. I nodded. Control often dresses itself as love. He was quiet for a long time after that. A month later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. I knew who it was from before I opened it. The words were careful. Measured. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sarah wrote. I just want you to know I never planned to be the villain in your story. I folded the letter and set it aside. Motivation doesn't erase harm. Explanation doesn't undo damage. I didn't respond. Daniel finalized the divorce not long after. There was no courtroom drama, no shouting matches. Just signatures and a quiet finality. He grieved in his own way. I didn't rush him through it. Loss is still loss, even when it's necessary. One evening, as we washed dishes together, he spoke again. I told my therapist what I did, he said. Cutting you off. Believing things without proof. I glanced at him. And? She said something that stuck with me, he continued. She said manipulation works best on good people. Because they're always trying to do the right thing. I smiled sadly. That sounds about right. There were moments when old fears crept back in. When Daniel disagreed with me and I felt my chest tighten, afraid any conflict might send him away again. But we talked about those moments. Named them. Took their power away. That was the difference now. One afternoon, I found myself at the same kitchen table where he'd called me toxic years before. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes in the air. I ran my hand over the chipped edge and smiled. So much pain had lived here. And yet, so much healing too. I realized then that I no longer needed validation from the people who had misjudged me. The truth had spoken for itself. Quietly. Firmly. At church, a woman approached me after service. You're very gracious, she said. I don't know if I could forgive like that. I shook my head gently. Forgiveness wasn't for them, I said. It was for me. That night, I sat on the porch alone, listening to crickets, the air warm and soft. I thought about all the mothers sitting in silence, wondering what they did wrong. Carrying shame that doesn't belong to them. I wished I could reach through the screen and tell them this. Being labeled toxic doesn't always mean you are. Sometimes it means someone needed you to be. I breathed in deeply and let the night settle around me. My story wasn't perfect. My family wasn't perfect. But it was honest. And that, I had learned, was enough. Life didn't return to what it had been before. It moved forward into something new, something quieter, steadier, shaped by lessons I hadn't asked for but now carried carefully. Daniel started coming to Sunday dinners again. Not every week, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. Sometimes he brought dessert from the bakery down the street. Sometimes he forgot and apologized like a little boy again. We laughed more than I expected we would. One evening, while we were clearing the table, he paused with a plate in his hands. Mom, he said, do you ever feel angry? I considered the question. The faucet ran softly between us, water pooling over my fingers. Yes, I said honestly. But not the way people expect. He waited. I'm angry at the lost time, I continued. At the moments that didn't happen. The ordinary ones. The phone calls. The holidays. But I'm not angry at you. He swallowed. You should be. I shook my head. If I held on to that anger, it would become the very thing you were accused of. And I won't let that happen. He nodded slowly, as if committing the words to memory. As months passed, the story became something people whispered less about. Scandals fade when there's no drama left to feed them. Sarah moved away. New job. New city. New beginning, I assumed. I didn't follow her life, didn't check social media, didn't ask mutual acquaintances for updates. Letting go meant letting go completely. Daniel began dating again, cautiously. He told me early, nervously, as if waiting for my approval. I trust you to choose what's right for you, I said. And to speak up if something feels wrong. He smiled, relieved. I will. One afternoon, while organizing old photo albums, I came across a picture of Daniel at 10 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, his arm thrown around my waist. I traced the edge of the photograph with my finger. I realized then how easily love can be reframed as threat when someone needs control. How quickly devotion becomes toxicity in the wrong narrative. That realization changed how I saw the world. I stopped shrinking myself to seem less threatening. Stopped softening my voice to avoid misinterpretation. Stopped apologizing for emotions that were never harmful in the first place. At the library, a younger coworker once confided in me about her strained relationship with her own mother-in-law. "She says I'm manipulative," the girl whispered. "But I don't think I am." I met her eyes. "Then trust that feeling," I said. "And pay attention to who benefits from that label." She looked thoughtful. Grateful. Healing, I learned, doesn't just repair you, it sharpens your vision. Daniel and I had one last conversation about Sarah months later, sitting on the porch as fall leaves skittered across the steps. "I don't hate her," he said again, like he needed to make peace with that truth. "But I see her clearly now." "That's all clarity ever promises," I replied. "Not comfort. Just truth." He leaned back, staring at the sky. "I don't want to repeat that pattern." "You won't," I said. "Because now you know what it looks like." He smiled faintly. "You were never toxic." I exhaled slowly, feeling something settle inside me at last. "I know," I said. And I did. Not because he said it. Not because others apologized. But because I had lived through the silence and come out intact. I had loved without controlling. Waited without demanding. Forgiven without forgetting. That's not toxicity. That's strength. The house was quiet that night, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of memory, of truth, of peace hard-earned. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and for the first time in years, I slept without replaying the past. Because some truths don't just come out. They set you free. If you're still here with me, then I want to slow things down for a moment. Not because the story is over, but because this is the part that matters most. Stories like mine don't end when the truth comes out. They don't end with apologies or realizations or even reconciliation. They end much later, in the quiet moments when you finally understand what all of it did to you, and what it taught you. For a long time, I thought being called toxic was the worst thing that could happen to a mother. That word burrowed into me. It followed me into the grocery store, into church pews, into my dreams. I'd hear it in my own thoughts when I hesitated before speaking. When I rewrote a message 10 times before sending it, or didn't send it at all. When I wondered if loving my son too much had somehow turned into something ugly without me noticing. And that's the thing about labels like that. They don't have to be true to be powerful. They only have to be repeated. I want you to understand something very clearly, especially if you've ever been cut off, shut out, or slowly erased from someone you love. Sometimes the problem is not your behavior. Sometimes the problem is that your presence threatens someone else's control. Control doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Often, it comes wrapped in calm voices, soft explanations, and reasonable-sounding boundaries. It comes disguised as protecting peace, or choosing my marriage, or doing what's healthiest. And sometimes, it comes at the cost of silencing someone who never meant harm in the first place. I spent years trying to earn my way back into my son's life. Do you know how exhausting that is? To constantly review your tone, your words, your memories, to wonder if every act of love was actually a mistake. To fear that standing up for yourself would confirm the very accusation you're trying to escape. I know many of you listening right now are living in that space. You're watching from the outside. You're waiting for calls that don't come. You're told to respect boundaries without ever being told what you crossed. You're shrinking yourself into something quieter, smaller, safer, hoping that one day, it will be enough. And I need you to hear this, gently but firmly. You cannot fix a story that was written to exclude you. You cannot reason your way out of a narrative that depends on you being the villain. And you cannot heal by begging for access to someone who has been taught to fear your love. What saved me wasn't confrontation. It wasn't proving my innocence. It wasn't revenge. It was truth, arriving in its own time, without my forcing it. And more importantly, it was the choice I made before the truth came out. The choice to keep my dignity. To not chase explanations from people who weren't listening. To sit with the pain instead of twisting myself into something unrecognizable just to be allowed back in. That choice didn't feel strong at the time. It felt lonely. But strength often feels like loneliness when you're surrounded by misunderstanding. If you're a parent listening to this, especially a mother, I want to say something that no one said to me when I needed it most. Loving your child does not make you toxic. Wanting connection does not make you manipulative. Grieving distance does not make you dangerous. And setting your own emotional boundaries does not make you cold. We live in a time where psychological language is powerful, and sometimes misused. Words meant to protect people are sometimes used to control them. Therapy terms become shields. Accusations replace conversations. And in that environment, quiet, loving people are often the easiest to blame. Because we question ourselves first. We assume fault. We apologize for things we don't fully understand. But here's the truth I earned the hard way. A truly toxic person rarely worries about being toxic. They don't lose sleep over it. They don't examine their motives with trembling hands. They don't grieve the pain of others. If you're doing those things, if you're hurting because you don't want to hurt anyone, then that alone tells me something about your character. My son once told me I was toxic. And when the truth came out, he didn't just see his wife clearly. He saw himself clearly. That was painful for him. Growth often is. But clarity is not about punishment. It's about responsibility. And responsibility, when faced honestly, becomes freedom. To those of you who are estranged right now, whether you're a parent, a child, a sibling, I want to be very careful here. Not every distance is manipulation. Not every boundary is a lie. Some separations are necessary. Some relationships are genuinely harmful. But if you've been cut off without explanation, if the reasons keep shifting, if you're described in extreme terms that don't match your lived behavior, if communication is framed as danger rather than dialogue, then it's okay to trust your confusion. Confusion is often the first sign that something isn't right. You don't need to defend yourself to everyone. You don't need to collect witnesses. You don't need to explain your pain to people who have already decided who you are. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back, not because you agree with the story being told about you, but because you refuse to participate in it. That doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop bleeding. I didn't know if my son would ever come back to me. I lived with that uncertainty for years. And if he hadn't, I still would have had to find a way to live fully, honestly, and gently with myself. That part matters. Because reconciliation is a gift, not a guarantee. Healing has to happen even if no one apologizes. Even if the truth stays buried. Even if your name is never cleared in every room it was spoken wrongly. Your worth cannot depend on someone else's awakening. And yet, sometimes, truth does come out. Sometimes, control slips. Sometimes, the story unravels. And when it does, I hope you remember this. You don't need to gloat. You don't need to punish. You don't need to relive the hurt just to prove it was real. Justice doesn't always look like consequences. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it looks like clarity. Sometimes it looks like being able to sit at your own table again without questioning your right to be there. Today, my relationship with my son is not perfect. It's honest. And I'll take honest over perfect every single time. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something, not to put you on the spot, but to invite reflection. Have you ever been labeled something that didn't feel true, but still changed how you saw yourself? Have you ever been pushed out of someone's life, not because of what you did, but because of who someone else needed you to be? And if you're on the other side of this, if you're the one who cut someone off, I hope you're brave enough to ask yourself why. Not with defensiveness. With honesty. Because stories like mine don't just belong to mothers and sons. They belong to anyone who has loved deeply, been misunderstood, and chosen dignity over destruction. Thank you for sitting with me. If this story touched something in you, if it felt familiar, or painful, or healing, you're not alone. And if you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have waited like I did? Would you have walked away sooner? Or are you still waiting for the truth to surface in your own life? If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about family, truth, betrayal, and healing, consider subscribing and supporting the channel. Sometimes, hearing someone else say the words you've been holding inside is the first step toward letting them go. Take care of yourself. And remember, your silence does not mean you were wrong. Sometimes it means you were strong enough to wait for the truth to speak for itself.